August 17, 1942. Before dawn on the surf-pounded shore of Makin Atoll in the Central Pacific, rubber boats from 2 American submarines push through heavy waves toward a Japanese-held island. Among the Marines wading ashore is a tall, thin officer with glasses, Major James Roosevelt, second in command of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. He is 34 years old. He is also the eldest son of the President of the United States. He could have spent the war anywhere he chose. He chose a rubber boat in the dark, off an enemy beach, with one of the most dangerous units the Marine Corps had. James Roosevelt was the President's son, and that fact could have kept him safe for the entire war. He had flat feet and stomach ulcers serious enough to excuse him from frontline duty. No one would have questioned a desk in Washington, but James insisted on the opposite. He had joined the Marine Corps Reserve, and when a new kind of unit was formed, commandos trained to strike from the sea behind enemy lines, he asked to join it. His commander was a legendary unconventional officer named Evans Carlson. The battalion's motto, borrowed by Carlson from China, was 2 words that would enter the American language: Gung Ho. But to understand why the President's own son was crawling up a Japanese beach in August 1942 and what it would cost the men around him, we have to look at why the raid was happening at all. In the summer of 1942, America was barely holding in the Pacific. The Marines had just landed on Guadalcanal, and the whole campaign hung by a thread. The Makin raid was designed as a diversion, a pinprick far to the north, meant to confuse the Japanese and pull their attention away from Guadalcanal. James Roosevelt and Carlson's raiders were the diversion. And diversions are, by design, expendable. The 2nd Raider Battalion trained for speed, surprise, and self-reliance. Carlson drilled into them a flat, almost radical idea for the time, that officers and enlisted men were equals in purpose, that everyone fought and everyone carried the load. Gung Ho meant work together. For the Makin raid, 211 raiders were packed into 2 large submarines, the Nautilus and the Argonaut, and carried 1,300 miles across the Pacific to a tiny coral atoll. They would paddle ashore before dawn, destroy the Japanese garrison, gather intelligence, and be gone before the enemy could react. That was the plan. Almost none of it survived the surf. The sea off Makin was rough that morning. The rubber boats, powered by unreliable outboard motors soaked by the waves, scattered in the dark. Squads landed in the wrong places. Some motors died completely, and Marines had to paddle by hand against the surf. The careful plan for a coordinated, silent landing dissolved within minutes, and then, by one account, a raider's rifle discharged by accident, stripping away whatever surprise remained. The Japanese garrison woke to the fact that Americans were on their island. James Roosevelt, ashore with the command group, found himself in exactly the kind of chaotic, close-range fight the raid was meant to avoid. What followed was a confused, vicious daylight battle across a narrow strip of palm and coral. The Japanese defenders fought hard, using snipers tied into the tops of palm trees. Carlson's raiders, scattered and improvising, fought back in small groups. Japanese aircraft arrived and bombed and strafed the island, and 2 flying boats trying to land reinforcements were shot down. James Roosevelt moved among the command element under fire, helping direct the fight and steady the men. For a president's son to be killed or captured behind enemy lines would have been a propaganda catastrophe. James seems to have given the danger no weight at all. By nightfall, Carlson's raiders held the island but were battered, low on ammunition, and unsure how many Japanese remained. Carlson decided to withdraw to the submarines, and here the raid's 2nd disaster began. The same surf that had scattered the landing now trapped the raiders trying to leave. Boat after boat was flipped and hurled back by the waves. Weapons, equipment, and strength were lost in the pounding water. Men who had survived the battle nearly drowned trying to reach the submarines offshore. Exhausted Marines were swept back onto the beach again and again through the night in the dark. What happened in the confusion of that withdrawal is the part the country was never fully told. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We are just getting to it. In the chaos of the surf and the dark, not every raider made it back to the submarines. When the Nautilus and the Argonaut finally pulled away from Makin, a small number of Marines, cut off, exhausted, or simply unaccounted for in the confusion, were left behind on the island. It was not cowardice, and it was not abandonment by intent. It was the fog of a botched extraction. But 9 Americans were now alone on a Japanese-held atoll. The 9 raiders left on Makin were eventually captured by the Japanese. They were taken to Kwajalein atoll, and there, months later, on the order of a Japanese admiral, all 9 were beheaded. Their fate was not known to the American command for a long time, and it did not come out fully until after the war, at the war crimes trials. The Makin raid had been sold to the public as a triumph, a daring strike that lifted American morale at a desperate moment. The 9 men left on the beach were the cost that stayed hidden. James Roosevelt made it back to the submarine. 9 of his fellow raiders did not. The Makin raid did lift American morale. Newspapers celebrated it. Carlson's raiders became famous, and the phrase Gung Ho spread across the country. But in cold military terms, historians have argued ever since about whether it was worth it. It wiped out the Japanese garrison, but it also alerted Japan to American interest in the Gilbert Islands, and many believe it led them to fortify nearby Tarawa, the atoll that, a year later, would cost the Marines one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. The diversion may have helped at Guadalcanal and hurt at Tarawa. James Roosevelt had been at the center of it. For his actions at Makin, James Roosevelt was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration the Navy gives for valor. The citation praised his coolness and leadership under fire. It was not a courtesy to the president's son. The men who were there respected him. He had paddled the same surf, taken the same fire, and asked for no protection. But the question hung over the award then and later: should the president's son have been there at all? If James had been killed or captured, the damage to American morale and to his father would have been incalculable. He knew that. He went anyway. Franklin Roosevelt had 4 sons, and all 4 served in uniform during the war, all 4 in harm's way. The president was sensitive to the charge that the powerful sent other people's children to fight while shielding their own. His son's service was, in part, an answer to that charge. But it was more than politics. James had genuinely wanted to fight, and his father, who had built his own life around overcoming the body that polio had broken, understood the need to prove oneself. Still, every time James shipped out, the most powerful man in the world waited for news like any other father. James Roosevelt did not stop after Makin. He continued to serve in the Pacific, took part in further operations, and rose in rank. By the end of the war, he had become a colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve, and he would later be promoted to brigadier general. He had earned, on his own, the kind of combat record that no one could dismiss as the privilege of his name. Then, on April 12, 1945, with the war in its final months, the news reached him that he had dreaded in a particular way. His father, the President of the United States, was dead. Franklin Roosevelt died at Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12, 1945, less than a month before victory in Europe, and 4 months before the end of the war. His sons had fought across the world. James, the eldest, had spent the war proving he was more than the president's son. Now the president was gone, and James was something new, a decorated combat marine, a man with his own record, stepping out of the largest shadow in American politics. What he did with the rest of his life would be measured against a name almost impossible to live up to. He had most of the century still ahead of him. James Roosevelt left active service and went into public life. He settled in California, entered politics, and in 1954 was elected to the United States House of Representatives, serving the Los Angeles area for more than a decade. He carried the family name into a new generation of American politics, though he never reached the heights his father had. He had a complicated personal life, several marriages, business ventures that rose and fell, and he lived, by any measure, a full and public American life. But he never traded on the Navy Cross. The Marine who had waded ashore at Makin spoke of it rarely. James Roosevelt died on August 13, 1991, in California. He was 83 years old. He had outlived his father by 46 years and spent them as a congressman, a businessman, a public man in his own right. All 4 Roosevelt brothers had gone to war, and all 4 had come home. A fact that, against the odds of 4 men in combat, was its own kind of miracle. And of the 4, it was James, the eldest, the one with the flat feet and the ulcers and every excuse to stay safe, who had gone ashore from a submarine onto an enemy beach with Carlson's raiders. The argument about Makin has 2 parts, and both are still alive. The first: was the raid worth it? A morale-boosting strike that may have provoked the fortification of Tarawa and cost 9 raiders their lives, beheaded on Kwajalein. The second: should James Roosevelt, the president's son, have been allowed to risk capture on it at all? He believed a man should not ask others to face what he would not. His critics believed the stakes were too high for one family to gamble with. Both can be true. He earned his medal honestly, and his presence there was a risk the nation's morale could not really afford. He went anyway. Brigadier General James Roosevelt died on August 13, 1991, at 83. He is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as a footnote to his father, a name on a list of Roosevelt children. But for one chaotic day and night in August 1942, on a coral atoll most Americans had never heard of. He was simply Major Roosevelt of Carlson's raiders, wading through the surf under fire, asking no protection his men were not given. The president's son who insisted on the most dangerous duty he could find. The Marine who came home when 9 of his raiders did not. The man who spent a lifetime proving he was more than a name. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the Marine Raiders in Carlson's 2nd Raider Battalion aboard the submarines Nautilus or Argonaut, on Makin or Tarawa or Guadalcanal or anywhere in the Pacific War, leave their name and what they did in the costume, bestu the ma. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, one thing they said, one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.